If you could stand on a street corner in New York City or Chicago exactly 100 years ago, in 1924, the world would feel familiar yet entirely alien. You would see the black Ford Model Ts rattling over cobblestones and hear the crackle of jazz music drifting out of speakeasies, because this was the era of prohibition, a time when the United States government legally banned the sale of alcohol. It was a decade of soaring skyscrapers and the birth of the modern consumer, but it was also a world where the average person had never seen a television, never flown in a plane, and lived a life dictated by the local community rather than a global network. As we look back through the lens of history, we see a century defined by extreme shifts between prosperity and struggle. By 1929, the roaring optimism of the 20s hit a brick wall. On October 29th, a day forever known as Black Tuesday, the stock market crashed. This was not just a bad day for investors, it was the beginning of the Great Depression. Millions of Americans lost their life savings as banks failed. Families who had once been comfortable found themselves standing in breadlines. In the Central Plains, the Dust Bowl turned the sky black, forcing thousands of farmers like those documented in Dorothea Lange's famous photographs to flee toward California in search of a survival that barely existed. It was Franklin Delano Roosevelt who stepped into this chaos in 1933, promising a New Deal. He sat by fireplaces and spoke to the nation over the radio, using a new medium to bring a sense of intimacy to the presidency. He built the bridges, the dams, and the parks we still use today. But as the American economy slowly crawled out of the dirt, the rest of the world began to burn. The 1940s changed America's place in the world forever. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor pulled a reluctant nation into World War II. This period saw a total mobilization of society. Women like the real-life inspirations for Rosie the Riveter walked into factories to build the B-29 bombers and the Sherman tanks that would eventually liberate Europe and the Pacific. The war ended in 1945, but it left the United States as a global superpower, standing face-to-face with the Soviet Union in a new kind of conflict, the Cold War. The late 1940s and 1950s brought an explosion of growth. Veterans returned home, bought houses in new suburbs like Levittown, New York, and started families, creating the baby boom. This was the era of the chrome-plated Chevy, the backyard barbecue, and the flickering glow of the first television sets in living rooms across the country. We saw the rise of Elvis Presley and the birth of rock and roll, a sound that terrified parents but thrilled a new generation of teenagers who had more or less invented the concept of youth culture. But under the surface of this suburban dream, a long overdue fire was burning. The 1950s and 60s saw the rise of the civil rights movement. In 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. In 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and told the world about his dream. This was a time of immense courage in the face of violent opposition. We saw the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 slowly begin to dismantle the legal structures of segregation that had existed since the end of the Civil War. Sad, the 1960s were also a decade of profound trauma. The country watched in horror as President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas in 1963. 5 years later, both Dr. King and Robert Kennedy were also taken by gunfire. At the same time, the Vietnam War was tearing the country apart. It was the first war fought in American living rooms, as nightly news broadcasts showed the brutal reality of the jungle to a public that was becoming increasingly disillusioned with its government. As we moved into the 1970s, that disillusionment deepened. The Watergate scandal forced Richard Nixon to become the first president in history to resign. The decade was marked by stagflation, gas lines, and the Iran hostage crisis. It felt as though the post-war engine of American progress had finally stalled. But even in the gloom, innovation was happening in garages in California. In 1976, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak formed Apple Computer, and a young Bill Gates was building Microsoft. The digital revolution was quietly beginning. The 1980s under Ronald Reagan saw a return to a more assertive American identity and a massive shift toward free market economics. It was a decade of excess, neon lights, and the rise of cable news with the launch of CNN. The Cold War, which had loomed over every American child for 40 years, finally began to thaw. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and by 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. For a brief moment, it felt as though history itself had reached a peaceful conclusion. Optimistic, the 1990s were characterized by the birth of the World Wide Web. Society moved from the physical to the digital almost overnight. We went from mailing letters to sending emails, from browsing libraries to searching Google. The economy soared under Bill Clinton, and despite the political bitterness of the Lewinsky scandal and impeachment, the turn of the millennium was met with deep hope and a colorful celebration. That optimism was shattered on September 11, 2001. The terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon fundamentally changed the American psyche. The nation entered a new era of perpetual war in Afghanistan and Iraq. Security became a constant presence in public life, and the Department of Homeland Security was formed. The unity Americans felt in the days after the attacks eventually gave way to deep political divisions that would only grow in the years to follow. In 2008, the world faced the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. The housing bubble burst, and names like Lehman Brothers became symbols of corporate collapse. But that same year, the country elected its first African-American president, Barack Obama, signaling a demographic and cultural shift that many thought impossible just decades earlier. The last 15 years have been a whirlwind of rapid technological change and social upheaval. We saw the rise of social media, which connected us in ways we never imagined while also fueling echo chambers and polarization. In 2016, the election of Donald Trump shattered traditional political norms and highlighted a deep divide between urban and rural America. Then, in 2020, the world stopped. The COVID-19 pandemic took over 1 million American lives and forced us into isolation, changing the way we work, learn, and interact. Thoughtful. Today, we stand at the end of this 100-year journey. We have gone from the telegraph to the smartphone, from the Model T to the electric car, and from the speakeasy to the global streaming service. We have seen great progress in human rights and breathtaking leaps in science, yet we grapple with many of the same questions of equality, justice, and the role of government that our great-grandparents faced in 1924. Think of the resilience required to navigate these 10 decades. The people of 1924 would barely recognize our world, but they would recognize our spirit. We are a nation that has been tested by economic collapse, world wars, social unrest, and a changing climate. Each time, the American story has been rewritten not by a single leader, but by the collective actions of millions of people trying to find their way through uncertain times. As we look toward the next 100 years, we carry the weight of this history with us. We are the products of the struggles of the 30s, the sacrifices of the 40s, the movements of the 60s, and the innovations of the 90s. Long behind us is long and often scarred, but it is a road that has always moved forward, driven by the persistent hope that the best chapters of the story have yet to be written. From the jazz clubs of the 20s to the digital landscapes of today, this has been the American century. It has been messy, it has been loud, and it has been revolutionary. And as the clock continues to tick, we are the ones who will decide what the next 100 years will look like. Whether we approach it with fear or with the same rugged optimism that built the skyline a century ago is entirely up to us.